Hello, my name is Julian Frazier, and once again, I am your fitness psychologist. Coming at you again without a PowerPoint presentation. Look, PowerPoints take a lot of time to make, and sometimes it's just easier to talk to you guys. I will be putting together some more information in the forms of PowerPoint presentations in the future. But for right now, this is what's going to have to work. It's going to have to do. Only so many hours in the day, and you got to spend some of those sleeping, apparently. So here we are, just you and I having a conversation. We're talking about a subject which is really important, and I think will become more and more a part of how we go about treating mental illness in the future. Is really the idea that exercise, physical activity, is something which is not just an adjunct therapy for depression, but in many cases can treat depression. And how do we know that? Well, I've recently done a meta narrative review, and so it's just combed the past 10 years of research about what do we know about the role of exercise, physical activity for the treatment of depression. And it turns out that there's a number of meta-analysis looking at various forms of exercise used for the treatment of depression. And we can say with a fair amount of certainty that at least for the cases of mild and moderate depression, that exercise is an intervention which can treat depression. And so there's going to be some caveats here that I'm going to talk about right now before we get into the meat and potatoes. And I'm going to explain it very simply on the front end, and then we'll dive into some of the deeper stuff. It's going to be really relatively quick, but if you want to just take my word for it and say that exercise is something that you should be doing, not just for your physical health, but for your mental health, then that's the punchline, right? And so here is the caveat. The first is that this is for educational purposes. And so even though I myself do some clinical work as a therapist, that this is not therapy and it's not meant to treat anything that you might be going through personally. And so take it with a grain of salt or two or four, and an exponential curve of salt. The next would be 8 and so on. Take it with a grain of salt and know that depending on what you're going through, that you still may need to consult an expert in the form of your medical doctor, PCP, or a therapist or behavioral health expert, those sorts of things, to figure out what's going to work exactly for you. The second caveat is that what we're talking about is more the mild and moderate ranges of depression, which are far more common than the severe and persistent forms of depression. So there's a category of mental disorder that we might think of as a big umbrella term called SPMI, severe and persistent mental illness. And many of these mental illnesses have a strong biological component. So I'm thinking of things like schizophrenia. I'm thinking of things like bipolar depression, which there's a strong biological component where we found that exercise alone is not likely going to be a treatment necessarily, as though exercise is not going to remove an individual's hallucinations or delusions, those sorts of things. So that's the bit more severe spectrum of mental illness. And while exercise cannot necessarily, or hasn't been shown to at least, treat these conditions, it is still a promotion of a general fitness and well-being. And so we know that folks in the SBMI, severe and persistent mental illness category, have higher rates of a number of other physical health issues. And again, exercise is already proven to be great for that. And so what are we talking about? Well, when I think of depression, I'm already thinking about how we describe a major depressive disorder or episode. And how we do that is we have an assessment. There's screeners. We gather a lot of information about a client. And what we're looking for is a certain number of symptoms. Right? And the more symptoms you've had and for longer, it kind of notes whether it's mild, moderate, or severe. This means that different individuals can have different clusters of symptoms, that somebody can be experiencing a major depressive episode, and that can look very different from another individual. What we're talking about today is specifically what we call anhedonic depression, which is basically the form of depression where the things that you used to enjoy, you get less enjoyment out of it. You get less excitement out of it. The hobbies that you used to engage in, you used to really enjoy spending time with your friends. You used to really enjoy work. And suddenly all these things, they go from being vibrant and something that adds to your life to feeling gray, like an obligation. When all of our life feels kind of anhedonic, we're very demotivated to do anything because nothing that we want to do feels like it's a good idea. And that impacts everything from the things that we do that we really enjoy to like the basic needs, right? Folks will lose their appetite. They'll lose the ability to sleep, all those sorts of things. That's one of the main areas that we're going to be focusing on, the one cluster of depressive symptoms. And so starting broadly, asking ourselves the question of what are some things which cause depression? And there's going to be three of them that I'm going to be focusing on today. The first one are going to be environmental factors. And sometimes those are things which are outside of ourselves, which negatively impact our life, and which the consequence of down the line is a form of depression. And so I give you an example of we've been in a pandemic for quite some time. Some folks have had a lot of insecurity in terms of work and in terms of their finances. And as we swing around into March, if it's been a year where you've been struggling one month to the next to make payments on rent and to afford food and all those sorts of things, then it's likely that's an environmental factor which is negatively impacting your life. And so we think of these as adjustment episodes, situations which kind of come out of left field and can kind of send your life for a loop. Absolutely, for many of these folks, when the pandemic is over, once they're able to reestablish work and get their finances back under them, the depression will lift. And so we can tell that the depression itself wasn't a result of something internal, but rather it was our internal environment reacting to the external demands, which were too much for us to be able to meet. And so that's number one. Number two and number three are actually, one of them is fairly intuitive. So number two is chronic stress. And so chronic stress might go along with external factors, but can be an impact of our internal makeup as well. If I'm thinking about things or my emotions are difficult to handle. And so chronic stress can come from a wide variety of different sources as well. And those can be interpersonal, those can be environmental. But we know that when folks are in a state of chronic stress, that psychological distress can manifest as depression. And number three is one that is actually on the more biological side of things. It's chronic inflammation. And so when I say inflammation, what I mean is an activation of our immune system. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. And so if our immune system is on for far too long, then depression is something that can result of that as well. And so environmental factors, things that we have to adjust to, which challenge us, demand us, and sometimes the demands of those challenges are too high that we lose a job and we're not able to get a job back because we're in a pandemic, right? Or we're going through a really tough breakup or a divorce or something like that. And it really just throws our entire lifestyle out of whack. A chronic stressor, right? So stress is something that's supposed to be brief and temporary, but when we stretch that out over months, years, decades even, that it throws a lot of our internal homeostatic mechanisms out of whack. And the same can be said for chronic inflammation. And we can find that all of these things are actually interrelated. They kind of form their own triad, if you will, where one can cause the other and all of them can cause depression. And so how does exercise play a role in alleviating all of these things? And so I'm going to start with chronic stress, actually, because we can kind of dive into the physiology of what exercise does for our body in order to allow us to alleviate some stress. So like I said before, stress is supposed to be something, and when I think of stress, I'm talking about distress, right? I'm thinking about the activation of our fight or flight in situations which it doesn't need to be active. Like if I'm taking a test, for example, I don't need to be ready to run from my test or fight my test. I just need to be able to take the test. But that's a situation which our fight or flight starts to get active as we have performance anxiety and we're thinking of all the consequences of if we get a low grade and all of those pressures. And so that situation, and also stress which is prolonged, which is if I fight or flight something right now, but maybe I'm thinking of something that's going to happen next week. And so my body's in a fight or flight reaction or ready to fight or flee, uh, all the way up to leading to the weekend where I have to do something which I'm not looking forward to, right? Situations where stress is not helpful, distress. And so chronic distress, I guess, or chronic stress as we tend to call it, is again an exaggeration of that fight or flight response. And I want you to think about this just for a second, that fight and flee or fight or flight, sorry, are they're both action oriented words. When our nervous system is activated to be able to respond to a threat, the it's expecting us to take action. It's expecting us to do something, to behave in a way that is action oriented. It's expecting movement, and that's exactly what it's trying to motivate us to do, to run away from something or to face it, to combat it. Unfortunately, for a number of us doing office jobs, we get an email from our boss, right, that we need to talk, and oh no, we're sitting still in our chair as our fight or flight response is going through the roof. And so there's this almost intuitive idea that when you're feeling a level of stress, which is the activation of your nervous system, that movement is kind of the natural consequence. That's what your body is expecting you to do, and it's expecting you to do that because that's what hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution has prepared us for. Right. So we're kind of in a situation where our evolutionary propensity is kind of at odds with our modern world or the demands of our modern world. And so that's the intuitive part of it. But the other side of that is, okay, what does exercise do for us? Well, in brief stints, exercise is actually itself a stressor. It's something which activates the body. That's why before we get into a bout of exercise or physical activity, we tend to warm up, right? Part of us is warming up our physical body and muscles and tendons and those sorts of things, but we're actually waking up our nervous system and our brain, and we're getting things moving, right? It's very activating. Some folks, if they work out too late in the day, they're actually too awake to get to bed, which sometimes seems counterintuitive. The piece that we want to look at is not when we initiate exercise, but what happens after exercise. So let's say that this is Colorado. We do a lot of hiking here. You do a lot of, you're sitting on a trail and you hike all the way up to the top of a mountain. Let's say you're out in Boulder doing some hiking. And once you get to the top, you have an opportunity to rest. And you notice that you're out of breath, you're sweating, you're kind of sore, but you're limber as well. You're awake, and all your senses are fairly attuned because you've had to be very mindful of each step that you take, because some of those paths are not entirely paved or flat. So you have to be very mindful of those sorts of things. And in those moments, you recognize that your breath is likely a little bit labored and deeper. And the moment that our body is like, okay, we no longer need to have all of these systems active, our brain's active, nervous system's active, muscles active, but we can relax now. It very naturally tapers off. It very naturally it wants to return to homeostasis. It wants to return to balance. And so when we start exercising, our stress goes up. And then when we're done exercising, our stress actually goes back down. And so exercise has a natural kind of reaction, which is relaxing after a bout of exercise. What's nice about this is that we don't have to exercise for a whole heck of a long time in order to get this relaxation response. And so there's been a lot of training for high intensity interval training, which is like taking a lot of activity and trying to squeeze into a short amount of time to show that, just 10 minutes of physical activity where you are increasing your heart rate and breathing in a more labored way is enough to have that relaxation response. For folks with chronic stress, and so I'm going to need you to work with me on some numbers here. Let's say you're chronically stressed and you've been that way for months, years, sometimes grad school feels like that, right? Months and years of chronic stress, always something due, always things to be aware of. You might hover at like a 3 out of 10 on the stressometer, where 10 is the most stressed you could be. That's a panic attack. And 0 is no stress at all, a vacation on a beach, right? It's most likely that from one day to the next. People are like a 1 out of 10 because they have things that they need to do and they're alert and awake. They're not lounging on the beach, for example, but they're going from one errand to the next. But folks with chronic stress might be at all times at a level that's like 3 or 4 out of 10, with intermittent moments of spikes where their stress shoots up to 8 or 9 and sometimes even 10, right, out of 10 on the stressometer. So they have those spikes and then the stress goes back down to 3 or 4. And so they always feel kind of stressed, always feel kind of anxious. And they don't really get much relief from that. There's just highs and lows, but never are they at that 1 or 0 mark. What we've seen with folks with these forms of chronic stress is that exercise is something that helps to regulate that. So if you have chronic stress, if you're at like a 3 or 4 or 5, and then you have a bout of exercise, the reactionary relaxation after the exercise actually takes folks from that 3 or 4 and then brings them temporarily back down to that 0 or 1. So maybe for an hour or 2, or for a day after exercising, or for the rest of the day, that chronic stress can be regulated by that reaction to exercise, to physical movement. And so to sum things up, you have stress, right? And the body and the mind expect that whenever the distress response, the fight or flight response is active, that we're going to do something, that we're going to move. Now, when we do move, that results in a natural relaxation response in our body as everything says, okay, we can turn the alarms off. We've done the moving. We've escaped the threat. We can relax. For a lot of folks, when the stress is chronic, one bout of exercise isn't going to make their problems go away. We use the environmental example, like if you have financial issues or you have problems in your relationships or you have problems at home, exercise isn't going to magically take those away. But what we want to do is avoid having a constant low level of anxiety with momentary spikes of anxiety. That we can still have be anxious sometimes, but we want to experience at least a few hours a day of not having that same level of anxiety and stress. And that can break up chronic stress. And so a lot of folks who are athletes, a lot of folks who enjoy various hobbies and sports that are active, find that they can manage their stress and anxiety by regularly involving themselves in some sort of physical activity. Right? And this is kind of intuitive for folks who recognize that their mental health is almost exclusively held together by their engagement in a sport or a hobby, and they find that the gym is a refuge for them. And so some folks have very intuitively stumbled upon the way that exercise helps to manage chronic stress. And since chronic stress can cause depression, that if we include exercise as part of our lifestyle, that we might also treat depression. This is good to know when we look at things like the CDC information on the number of folks who participate in at least the minimum amount of recommended exercise. 25% of adults seem, by 1 in 4, seem like they or will self-report that they meet the minimums for movement or physical activity within a week, which means that 75% of adults self-report that they don't meet those minimums or that they are entirely sedentary. They don't do any amount of exercise. And so we can see how such large amounts of lack of movement is something which could contribute to higher rates of depression. As fewer and fewer people move, the demands of our environment become more and more stressful, and exercise is not a part of many people's lifestyle, most people's lifestyle. Seems like a low-hanging fruit to me when I'm thinking of how do we approach depression and alleviating depression and stress on a population scale when we're thinking about states or regions or a country, for example. Those numbers stack up very quickly. The other piece of that pie that I'm going to talk about is chronic inflammation. And so that's the more part that's more physiological, biological. And you have to know a little bit about the immune system and how all of that works. I'm going to try to keep it really simple, but if you are really interested in this, there's a whole field of research called Psychoneuro Immunology, right? Psycho being the mind, neuro being the brain, immunology being our immune system and how those things interact. This is the best way that I can explain it briefly. If you've ever had a cold or a flu or just been sick, how do you feel? Well, there's the symptoms, based off of what you have. You got some congestion, some sniffles, you kind of feel achy. Sometimes if it's really bad, you have a fever, you have some chills, those sorts of things. But there's also mental pieces, right? So, being sick can interrupt your sleep. It can make you sleep too much or too little. It can interrupt your appetite. So I know when I'm sick with some things, nothing tastes good and I don't necessarily feel hungry, right? And I also find that I don't have a lot of energy, right? I often feel really depleted and like I need to rest. It kind of has this kind of low level fatigue where I just kind of feel gross and achy. And I don't want to be around people. I have this tendency or desire to want to distance myself from others. I'm very demotivated in that way. In fact, I'm not very motivated to do a whole lot. And even if I wanted to use my sick days to try to work on something else, I have a really difficult time concentrating. Like my brain is in this fog. It's this state where even if I looked at the same sentence, I'd have to read it 2 or 3 times before it kind of stuck, right? So I'm not very effective or efficient. What we found is that the psychological effects of being sick are very similar to what it's like to be depressed. And so we can see these parallels, these places where it overlaps. And it turns out that the higher levels of inflammation in the body, and when I say inflammation, I mean activation of our immune system. So the more active our immune system is, the more likely it is that we're going to experience symptoms of depression. Why would that be the case? Why would we get depressed whenever our immune system is active? Okay, let's go back 10,000 years ago. We're going to look at this from the scope of evolutionary psychology. And so if I'm sick, and I'm a part of a tribe or a band of somewhere between 50 and 250 people. And, I'm an adult, so I know every person's face and I know everybody's family and I know everybody by name. Well, if I'm sick, first of all, it's usually some sort of infection, a viral infection or bacterial infection, or I've been injured for a really long time. But I don't want to pass that sickness on to the rest of my tribe. I don't want to pass that on to my band. Not only do I not want to do that, but I would want to prioritize rest in order to overcome this sickness. Because back then, we don't have the same level of pharmaceutical medications that can help us to decrease symptoms or to get rid of the infection or those sorts of things or suppress the infection. So I actually want to prioritize resting. And our brain says, well, if I left this human up to their own devices, they're going to ignore their symptoms and keep going on about life as normal, which means that they're going to spread whatever they have to everyone around them because humans are very social. And because they're hunter-gatherers, they're likely going to use a lot of their energy hunting and gathering instead of recovering from the illness that they have. And so one trick I can play, being the smart evolution brain that I am, is that I can demotivate him entirely, him or her or they. I can completely remove, their motivation. If they try to do something, I can make them really unfocused. I can make them sleepy. I can make them not really enjoy things. And that way they'll be, by being demotivated and doing everything else, that they'll likely prioritize rest and sleep and recovery and those sorts of things that they need in order to overcome the illness that they have. And so we might find that in those circumstances, depression actually has an advantage in that it sidelines us whenever we really do need to rest. And those times are when the immune system is active. And the immune system is active most commonly when we're sick. The question is, are there times, especially in the modern era, where we aren't sick, but our immune system is active? The answer to that question, as you might imagine, is yes. That there are many things which can contribute to an increase in body inflammation, increase in the general level of activity of our immune system. Some of those things are Stress. Oh, this is how chronic stress and the immune system might be connected. One of those things is nutrition, right? If we eat, I think about it. Every time you eat something, all the germs that's on the thing that you're eating is going in your mouth and into your body, and your immune system has to deal with that. And so not only is, I mean, your hands kind of germy and the utensils you use kind of germy, and the food is probably a little bit germy, your immune system's handling all of that. But if what you eat is highly processed and it has a lot of non-food additives and a number of other contributing factors to food having low nutritional quality, then your immune system's like, what the heck do I do with all of this, right? And so a poor quality diet can increase inflammation. Injuries can lead to inflammation, especially if they're long-term injuries. If you've broken things, if you've had really important surgeries, those sorts of things can lead to inflammation. Are we still here? Okay, I'm still recording. It cut off a little bit. I think we were talking about things that could lead to inflammation. Okay, I'm just going to continue. See, this is why I need a good camera. I'm going to get a new camera. And B, I need like some software that I can edit these things, because then I can make this much more brief by cutting the important snippets. And when things like this happen, I can handle it a little bit better. Okay, long story short, if our immune system's active in our body, then we might experience symptoms of depression, because depression is our body's way and our brain's way of demotivating us so that we will prioritize rest. Exercise happens to be a great form of anti-inflammatory. Why is that? Again, when I am moving, when I'm active, when that fight or flight response is active, do I want my immune system to be taking all of the energy? Usually no. Usually what I want is for my muscles to be active, my nervous system to be active, my brain to be active whenever I'm moving and engaged in something. And I don't want my immune system humming in the background, taking up too much of that energy for the efficiency of my body, right? And so it turns out one of the primary stress responses, cortisol, is actually an anti-inflammatory. That's why a lot of folks with pain disorders, or if they've had an injury or they have arthritis, they'll get a cortisone shot in that area in order to try to decrease the inflammation, decrease the pain, right? And so it makes sense that when our fight or flight goes up, things that are kind of maintenance level, like digestion, immune system, goes down. And so brief bouts of exercise, physical activity, is something which in the short term increases stress. We've already mentioned that. And as a result of that increase in stress, we get a brief relief from inflammation across the body. And so we want to think about using exercise for both reasons. At the front end of exercise, when we're really engaged in moving, whether that's physical activity in the form of sports or hobbies, or you're in the gym purposefully moving weight around, right? That on the front end, that is decreasing inflammation and helping to control inflammation by prioritizing movement. And on the back end, the reaction of exercise regulates our stress response and alleviates stress. And so if exercise, physical activity, movement is part of our lifestyle, say you're doing this every day, then every day you're helping to regulate your body's immune system, your inflammation levels, and every day you're helping to regulate your body's stress levels, right? All of that is to say that there's likely a third cause, which is a modern cause, which is, we've alluded to already, is sedentary behavior. There's a lot of good research that shows that being inactive is one of the leading driving causes of both physical and mental disorder. So if you are inactive for a long period of time, that's usually starting at 6 weeks and expanding out to months, years, etc., that the outcomes become worse and worse. Again, our brain, our body, our muscles, everything functions on this kind of use it or lose it mentality. That if you're not using it, you must not need it. And so in order to be more efficient, we're just going to down regulate that thing. If I'm not using my muscles, if I'm not moving, if I'm not engaged in some physical activity, then our body goes, well, what do we need all of this muscle for? We can definitely use those resources other places and we'll be more efficient. So let's just like get rid of some of that. The same thing happens with your brain. Yeah, if you don't use certain parts of your brain or you're not engaged in some level of thought, then the neurons that connect them become weaker and weaker over time. And why? Because, oh, well, there's nothing that is stimulating them to reconnect them. What we found is that because sedentary behavior and sedentary lifestyles are more possible today in developed worlds than they've ever been, that more and more people are choosing to be sedentary. And as a result, our body is getting rid of all the things that it doesn't feel that it needs anymore. This ends up being a form of stressor when our body starts getting rid of things, or getting rid of it puts aside things which are necessary for homeostasis. So our brain slows down, our body slows down physically, all of the pieces which used to help to maintain balance, it's getting rid of because it doesn't think that it needs it. And so at the very least, you don't have to meet the CDC recommendations of 150 minutes of cardiovascular exercise a week, broken up over 3 to 4 days. So you can consider that. But at least trying to do something every day to move, even if that's just going for a walk around the block or 5 minutes of some sort of physical activity, 10 minutes, something is going to be better than nothing. What's also interesting is that they've done reviews trying to see, okay, what does the dose or what kinds of exercises, because we can see that there's a difference between cardiovascular exercise and weight training and even things like yoga, which is kind of isometric and mobility based. It turns out that you can receive these benefits without specifying a different kind of exercise. And so any kind of exercise, no matter what you're engaged in, is going to be, at the very least, a protective factor against depression and can be highly recommended for folks with clinical depression symptoms as a form of treatment. Last but not least, I think that you can go into the weeds with that a little bit. I think, for example, if I were going to go into a weed, cardiovascular exercise where you're moving through space is something which activates brain-derived neurotropic factor, which for adults is something that's really important for ongoing brain neuroplasticity. It's a big way of saying that when you move through space physically, it's something which turns on the parts of your brain which are adept to learning new things. This kind of makes sense that that would be specialized as opposed to weight training, where I'm moving an object through space. But I myself am not necessarily having to scan my horizon or my environment to learn new things. So if you're, training for brain clarity and for, facilitating learning, let's say that you're just trying to study something, then you might want to do more cardiovascular exercise. But we've also seen the opposite, right? That weight training improves the efficiency of our nervous system, right? Because it's likely that the muscles that you have some limitations. Like the muscles on your back are strong enough that if they all seized up at once, they could probably actually break your bones. Like that's how strong your body is that your body could break your own body. So there's some limitations on that. And the more that you engage with weight training, for example, the more refined that becomes. So you can get more and more out of the body and muscles that you already have. And so for a lot of people who start weight training, the first 6 weeks, they'll experience a lot of increase in their strength, but not increase in muscle mass. And it's actually because their nervous system and their muscles are becoming more efficient. So I can get into the weeds about all of those little nitpicky pieces, but for folks who are, working with depression, what we really want to do is to break this cycle where depression leads to fatigue and lack of motivation. And that leads to a disengagement from activity and therefore leads to more depression. There's this cycle where, let's say that I did exercise and then I went through an episode of depression. So I stopped exercising, but exercise was something which helped me to control my depression. And so my depression gets worse over time because I'm less engaged. So one of our frontline interventions is just behavioral activation, right? Is getting folks back into the things which they used to enjoy to break up those cycles, those depressive spirals. Again, these are some things that I'm thinking about when I'm doing my clinical work. And as I continue to advocate for fitness psychology, for the inclusion of exercise and the training of future therapists, counselors, mental health professionals in exercise and nutrition psychology, because these are things that we have to know if we're going to be most effective in treating these things. If you're not a mental health professional and you're just an individual sitting around, you might be thinking of some ways that you can include movement, physical activity, exercise into your lifestyle. A lot of things that I enjoy doing. I hate treadmills. I love things that it feels like I'm active and I'm engaged in some mastery of a thing. So kickboxing was really fun. Climbing is really fun. For those of you who know me, I do a little bit of parkour, right? It's not something that many PhDs, I imagine, are doing free running out there. If you don't know what that is, don't Google it. In any case, we now have enough evidence to say that exercise is a fair treatment for depression, for mild and moderate symptoms, and is a therapeutic for severe and persistent symptoms. And now that we have a good understanding of this, and our understanding is becoming better and better as we do even better science, now we need to start actually taking what we know and applying it. And that's a lot about what fitness psychology strives to be. And that's where we'll end off for today. So I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you're finding ways to get moving, especially as we transition into spring and summer, and there's all kinds of opportunities to move, and hopefully we get some relief from the pandemic situation. I'm Julian Fraser. I've been your fitness psychologist. These are free every week. I hope to upload more often. I hope to include PowerPoints as necessary, and it has been a lot of fun providing this for you. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to continue this conversation, nerd out on all these sorts of things that I love. Okay, have a good day.